6 months after I buried my husband, his mother sat across from me at the kitchen table and said, "You'll marry his brother. It's already decided." I remember thinking, decided by who? Because it certainly wasn't decided by me. But to understand how that conversation even became possible, I need to take you back to the morning I got the phone call that changed everything. The phone call came at 6:14 in the morning, and I know the exact time because I've replayed that moment so many times it's carved into me now. It was a police officer's voice, careful and practiced in the way people get when delivering the worst news of someone's life for the hundredth time. My husband, Marcus, had been in an accident on his drive home from a night shift. He didn't make it. I was 31 years old. We'd been married for 5 years. And in the space of one phone call, I went from being a wife to being something I didn't have a word for yet. I want to tell this story carefully, because what happened to me in the months after Marcus died isn't something most people expect. And I think that's exactly why it needs to be told. This isn't a story about losing someone. It's a story about what people tried to take from me after I already thought I'd lost everything. Marcus came from a large, tightly knit family, the kind where holidays meant 30 people crammed into one house and nobody ever really left the fold, not even after marriage. When we got together, I was warned, gently, by a cousin of his, that his family did things the old way. I didn't fully understand what that meant at the time. I thought it meant big dinners and strong opinions about seasoning. I didn't understand that it also meant a set of expectations about what happens to a widow. I met Marcus when I was 24 at a mutual friend's barbecue, and I remember being struck by how easily he laughed, how he made space for other people in a conversation instead of dominating it. He was the kind of man who remembered small details, the name of your childhood dog, the fact that you took your coffee with too much cream. When he proposed 2 years later, on a hiking trail we'd taken on our third date, I said yes before he even finished the sentence. Marrying into his family meant marrying into a whole ecosystem of aunts, uncles, and cousins who all seemed to know each other's business in a way my own small family never had. At first I found it charming, even enviable. I'd grown up an only child with parents who kept mostly to themselves, and suddenly I had this enormous, noisy, opinionated family who folded me in like I'd always belonged there. Diane, Marcus's mother, taught me her recipe for the stuffing she made every Thanksgiving, guarding it like a state secret from everyone except, apparently, me. I felt chosen. I felt lucky. It didn't occur to me, in those early years, that being folded into a family so completely might also mean being expected to follow rules I hadn't fully understood I'd agreed to. Marcus himself never mentioned anything about widow traditions or expectations tied to his family's old ways. I don't know, even now, whether he genuinely didn't know about it, or whether it was simply a conversation that never needed to happen while he was alive. Some traditions, I've since learned, only reveal themselves when the person who would have objected to them is no longer there to object. The funeral itself is mostly a blur to me now, a wash of black clothing and casseroles and people hugging me a little too long. But I remember one moment clearly. Marcus's mother, Diane, held my hands at the reception afterward and said, "You're still part of this family. That doesn't change." At the time, I found it comforting. I had no idea it was actually a warning, dressed up as reassurance. The weeks right after the funeral are strange in ways nobody prepares you for. People show up constantly at first, casseroles and phone calls and offers to help with paperwork, and then, almost overnight, they stop. The house goes quiet. The casseroles run out. Everyone else's life resumes its normal shape while yours stays frozen at the exact moment the phone rang. I remember sitting in our bedroom closet more than once, surrounded by Marcus's shirts, just breathing in whatever was left of him in the fabric before it faded completely. I remember forgetting, 4 whole seconds at a time, that he was gone, reaching for my phone to text him something funny I'd seen, before the memory caught up with my hand. Diane called me almost every day during those first few weeks, and at the time I was grateful for it. I thought she was checking on me the way any mother-in-law might check on a grieving daughter-in-law. Looking back, I wonder how much of that early attentiveness was genuine comfort and how much was already, quietly, an assessment. Was I coping well? Was I likely to move away? Was I going to be, in her words later, difficult about things? The pressure didn't start immediately. Grief has its own timeline, and even a family with old-fashioned ideas about widowhood seem to understand you don't push an agenda on someone who's still sleeping with the lights on because the dark reminds her too much of the last night she didn't know was the last night. It started around month 4. Small things at first. Marcus's brother, Thomas, began showing up more. He'd come by to fix something around the house, even things that weren't broken. He mowed my lawn without asking. He started attending the same grief support meetings I'd mentioned once, in passing, to his mother. I told myself he was just being a good brother-in-law, helping a widow the way families are supposed to help each other. I want to be honest that I didn't see it for what it was until much later, because I think some part of me needed to believe that people were being kind to me simply because I deserved kindness, not because they had a plan for my life that I hadn't agreed to. The first time anyone said it outright was at a family dinner around month 5. Marcus's aunt, a woman named Carol who I'd always liked, leaned over during dessert and said, quite casually, as if she were commenting on the weather, "It's good that Thomas is around so much. It'll make things easier when the two of you eventually marry." I laughed, actually laughed, because I thought it was some kind of joke I wasn't fully understanding. Nobody else at the table laughed with me. That was the first time I felt something cold settle into my stomach. I asked Marcus's sister about it privately a few days later, thinking maybe I'd misunderstood. Maybe Carol was just an eccentric old woman who said strange things. My sister-in-law looked at me with something like pity and explained, gently, that in their family, when a husband died young, it was tradition, expectation really, for a widow to marry the husband's brother, if he was unmarried. It kept the family together. It kept the widow protected. It kept everything and everyone in place. I asked her how many times this had actually happened, half expecting her to admit it was some vague, half-remembered custom nobody had followed in generations. Instead, she named 2 women without hesitation. Marcus's own great-aunt, decades earlier, and a more distant cousin by marriage in the generation before that. Both had, apparently, done the right thing, as my sister-in-law put it, and married their husbands' brothers within 2 years of being widowed. She said it so matter-of-factly, like she was reciting a family recipe rather than describing 2 women's entire futures being decided for them. Around the same time, Marcus's uncle, a quiet man named Robert who I'd always found easy to talk to, started dropping by under the guise of helping me with the yard work Marcus used to handle. He never said anything explicit about Thomas, but he'd mention, almost wistfully, how good it would be for the family to stay whole. I didn't understand yet that staying whole was code for a very specific outcome, one that had already been decided long before anyone said it to my face. I want you to understand that I did not agree to this. Not once. Not implicitly. Not by staying quiet. Not by continuing to have dinner with them, because I had no way else that felt like family anymore since my own parents had passed years earlier and Marcus's family was, functionally, the only one I had left. But the pressure built the way pressure always does in families like that. Not through a single dramatic confrontation, but through 100 small moments designed to make refusal feel almost impossible. Diane started introducing me to people as Thomas's future wife at a cousin's wedding months before I'd agreed to anything. Thomas started referring to our house when discussing my future. Family members who had been warm to me suddenly grew cold and distant whenever I hesitated, as if my grief itself had an expiration date and mourning too long or mourning wrong was its own kind of betrayal. The conversation at the kitchen table, the one I mentioned at the start, happened at month 6. Diane came over unannounced, sat down across from me, and said the words plainly for the first time. "You'll marry Thomas. It's already decided." I asked her, as calmly as I could manage, decided by whom? She looked at me like the question itself was disrespectful. "By the family," she said. "This is how we take care of our own." I told her I needed time. She told me time was a luxury I didn't actually have, that a widow living alone reflected poorly on the family, that people would talk, that Marcus would have wanted his brother to look after me, as if my dead husband had left behind a set of instructions for who I should marry next, as if grief came with an inheritance clause nobody had told me about. I want to pause here and say something important. If you've never been in a situation like this, it can be hard to understand why I didn't simply say no and walk away immediately. But when an entire community, an entire extended family, presents something as inevitable as already settled, it does something to your sense of what's possible. I had lost my husband. I had, in a very real sense, also lost my sense of having any say over my own life, because grief had hollowed out the part of me that used to fight for things. It took me nearly 2 months after that kitchen table conversation to fully understand what I actually wanted, separate from what everyone around me insisted was already true. And what I wanted was simple. I did not want to marry Thomas. I did not want to spend the rest of my life as a solution to a family's discomfort with an unmarried widow. I wanted to grieve Marcus on my own terms, and eventually, if I ever loved again, I wanted it to be a choice I made freely, not an obligation dressed up as tradition. The hardest part wasn't deciding what I wanted. It was finding the strength to say it out loud in a room full of people who had already built an entire future around my compliance. I chose a family gathering to do it, deliberately, the same way they had chosen public settings to normalize the idea in the first place. I remember getting dressed that evening with my hands actually shaking, rehearsing the words in the bathroom mirror like I was preparing for a job interview instead of a dinner with people I'd once considered my closest family. Part of me wanted to lose my nerve and let the evening pass quietly, the way I'd let so many other comments pass in the months before. But I kept thinking about Robert's face when he talked about his aunt living a life she never chose, and I didn't want to become someone else's cautionary story 15 years from now. At a birthday dinner for one of the younger cousins, when Diane made another passing comment about the wedding, I finally said, clearly enough for the whole table to hear, that there would be no wedding. That I was grateful for the family's support since Marcus's death, but that no one, not Diane, not Thomas, not tradition itself, had the right to decide who I married. Thomas, to his credit, didn't say much in that moment. I think, looking back, some part of him had also been swept along by his mother's certainty rather than driving it himself. But Diane didn't let it go so easily. She asked me, in front of everyone, whether I understood what I was giving up, whether I understood that no one else would look after me the way this family would, whether I was prepared to be alone. I told her I would rather be alone by choice than accompanied by obligation. I don't know where those words came from in that moment, but I've held on to them ever since. The silence that followed was heavy. Thomas looked humiliated. Diane looked, for the first time since I'd known her, genuinely furious rather than performatively concerned. Carol muttered something about ingratitude, but I remember one of Marcus's younger cousins, a woman named Elena who'd always been quiet at these dinners, catching my eye from across the table and giving me the smallest, most genuine nod I'd seen from anyone in that family in months. The aftermath was not gentle. I was, for a while, quietly frozen out. Invitations stopped coming. Diane stopped answering my calls. A few relatives who had once dropped by to check on me now treated me like I had betrayed some sacred agreement I never actually made. It was lonely in a way that surprised me, losing an entire extended family a second time, in a completely different way than I'd lost Marcus. There were nights in the weeks that followed where I questioned whether I'd done the right thing, whether I'd been too harsh, whether I should have found a gentler way to decline something that had clearly meant so much to all of them. Grief has a way of making you doubt your own right to want things, especially when the people around you frame their control as devotion. I'd wake up at 3 in the morning replaying Diane's face at that dinner table, the fury in it, and wonder if I'd just destroyed the only sense of family I had left. It was Robert, of all people, the uncle who used to help with the yard work, who called me about 3 weeks after that dinner. I almost didn't answer, assuming it was another attempt to change my mind. Instead, he told me, quietly, that he'd always thought the tradition was outdated, that he'd watched his own aunt live what he described as a life she never chose, and that he was sorry nobody in the family had stood up for me sooner. It wasn't much. He didn't reconnect me with anyone else, didn't change Diane's mind. But it was the first sign that not everyone in that family had been complicit, even if most of them had stayed silent. But I want to tell you what happened after that loneliness, because I think it's the part of the story that matters most. I started rebuilding a life that belonged only to me. I reconnected with a close friend from college who I'd let drift away during the years I poured myself entirely into Marcus's family. I started volunteering at the same grief support group Thomas had once used as an excuse to insert himself into my life, except now I was there for myself, and I found real comfort in it, the kind that doesn't come with strings attached. About a year later, Elena reached out to me, the cousin who'd nodded at me that night. She told me she'd left the family gathering circuit almost entirely herself, tired of watching how women in that family were expected to disappear into whatever role was most convenient for everyone else. We became close friends. She was, in many ways, the only piece of that family I chose to keep. I never remarried Thomas, obviously. I don't know what became of him beyond a few pieces of secondhand information. I heard he eventually married someone else, someone the family had apparently already begun grooming for the role I'd refused. I try not to think about her too much, though I hope, if she ever finds herself in a similar position, that she has an easier time saying no than I did. If you take one thing from this story, I want it to be this. Grief makes you vulnerable to people who present control as care. It took me far too long to understand that a family insisting they were taking care of me while deciding my future without my input was not protection. It was possession. Real care asks, it doesn't decide for you and call the decision already made. I still think about Marcus every day, but I no longer think of myself as an unfinished sentence waiting for his family to write the ending. I wrote my own ending, and it didn't include a wedding I never agreed to,